This is the second in a series of videos responding to Jimmy Corsetti, a YouTuber and pseudo-archaeologist who promotes so-called alternative history narratives and argues against the conclusions of mainstream professional archaeologists. In this video, we'll see how Jimmy made various claims about trees planted at Gobekli Tepe, a highly important archaeological site in Turkey. In a previous video, I showed how Jimmy invented a conspiracy theory which claimed the trees had been deliberately planted specifically in order to prevent its excavation and conceal the important archaeological remains beneath the soil. I showed that after months of being told by archaeologists he was wrong, Jimmy finally dropped the conspiracy theory and started agreeing with the archaeologists, at least on this point. However, he didn't ever apologize for spreading his original conspiracy claim to millions of people, nor did he even acknowledge that he had been wrong for months, while real archaeologists had been telling the truth, and he had been telling people not to listen to them. This time, we'll see how Jimmy claimed he was the first to identify the potential danger these trees represented to the site, and also claimed there was no plan to remove these trees from the site until months after he agitated for it. We'll also see how all those claims were false. In fact, he was nearly 8 years late to the knowledge that the trees were a potential danger, a fact which real archaeologists had already noted and recorded in a document freely available on the internet for anyone to read. Along the way, we'll also see how Jimmy linked to what he claimed was Gobekli Tepe's official site management plan, which actually turned out to be a random university student's graduation thesis. On screen now is an image from the official site management documentation in 2017, showing clearly the 4 areas where olive trees had been planted at Gobekli Tepe and stating explicitly that they will be removed. 3 of them are marked, quote, long-term, removal of olive trees, end quote, and 1 of them is marked, quote, mid-term, removal of olive trees, end quote. It's important to remember that this was back in 2017, 7.5 years before Jimmy was talking about the olive trees, because Jimmy has persistently claimed no such plans ever existed. In fact, we'll see there was already a plan to remove the trees as far back as 2016. If you want to skip ahead to that part of the video, use the timestamps in the video description to navigate to the section Jimmy claims there was never a plan to remove the trees. Jimmy claims he was the first to raise tree root damage. On the 11th of June 2024, Jimmy tweeted, quote, were trees orchards planted over buried ancient ruins at Gobekli Tepe? Look at before-after pictures. 1. This would prevent excavation. 2. Tree roots can be very destructive. End quote. He continued to tweet on this the next day with comments such as, quote, asking again, were these orchards of trees planted on top of ancient ruins at Gobekli Tepe? Not only would this prevent excavation, the tree roots are incredibly destructive. End quote. At that time, archaeologist Oliver Dietrich explained the trees had not yet been removed, quote, because they stand in areas with over 1 meter of rubble above archaeological structures, end quote, adding, quote, the roots are preventing erosion, thus in fact protecting the archaeology. If you wanted to know whether excavations are planned in these areas, ask the project staff, end quote. Yet Jimmy kept insisting that the trees had been planted to prevent the site being excavated, writing on the 22nd of June 2024, quote, any effort to keep knowledge of our ancient past hidden is a total crime. And it's beyond me that more archaeologists and academics aren't detesting the trees and concrete that was placed over ruins, end quote. Now, the idea of concrete being placed over ruins might sound rather dramatic and certainly destructive, but despite Jimmy's alarmist phrasing, this was not a case of pouring concrete all over exposed archaeological artifacts. You can even find people claiming concrete was being poured directly over the large stone structures at Gobekli Tepe, but nothing like that was actually happening. We'll examine Jimmy's claims about the site being damaged by concrete and construction in a later video. On the 1st of August 2023, an article on the Hurriyet Daily News website commented on the planting of the olive trees at Gobekli Tepe, stating that Necmi Karol, the head of the excavation, quote, has denied recent reports which surfaced in both Turkish and international media that operations at the Neolithic site had ceased and that trees had been planted in the protected area, end quote. The article continued, quote, The excavation team confirmed the presence of olive trees, stating that they were there from the outset, end quote. This was a direct contradiction of Jimmy's claim that the trees had not been planted by a local owner, but in order to prevent further excavation. Very importantly for our topic, the article commented further on the olive trees, saying the excavation team, quote, was working with the Culture and Tourism Ministry to relocate them without disrupting the ongoing work or damaging the trees, end quote. Also very relevant are Nekmi's further comments, quote, everyone fabricates a different story. There are those who say excavations are being prevented because the true religions will be revealed, end quote. And, quote, as a scientist, I say they are nothing more than conspiracy theorists, end quote. Remember, this was on the 1st of August 2024. 3 weeks later, Jimmy uploaded his video, The Gobekli Tepe situation is worse than I thought, which I cited in my previous video. And in this video, he actually referred to the article from back on the 1st of August. In this video, Jimmy totally rejected the fact that the trees had been planted by the landowners in order to increase the value of the land, but he also took issue with some of Nekmi's other statements. Significantly, Jimmy regarded the article as targeting himself, saying, quote, firstly, he falsely misquoted me as saying that excavations had stopped or were otherwise suspended at Gobekli Tepe, end quote. But Jimmy wasn't misquoted at all in the article. He wasn't even quoted. In fact, he wasn't even cited or named in the entire article. You can't misattribute a quote to someone if you never actually name them and never attribute a direct quotation to them. It certainly seems Nekmi had Jimmy's video in mind, since in an article 3 days later, Nekmi said he was addressing an American content creator and cited the ad Jimmy had used in his video. Jimmy further cited Nekmi mentioning what Jimmy referred to as, quote, a massive controversy of planting hundreds of trees on and around the site of Gobekli Tepe, end quote. Jimmy claimed Nekmi's explanation for the presence of the trees, quote, makes no sense, end quote. But there's something else about the article's comment on the trees which is important. Remember I mentioned the article stated specifically, quote, the excavation team confirmed the presence of olive trees, stating they were there from the outset, and stressed they are working with the Culture and Tourism Ministry to relocate them without disrupting the ongoing work or damaging the trees, end quote. Note that the excavation team was already, quote, working with the Culture and Tourism Ministry to relocate the trees without disrupting the ongoing work or damaging the trees, end quote. Jimmy did not mention this at all in his video, which is unusual given the fact that he mentioned just about everything else the article said about the trees. Of course, the fact that archaeologists were already aware of the trees' potential to damage archaeological remains, had already planned the trees' removal, and were already working with the government to have the trees removed, was not at all convenient to the conspiracy theory of Jimmy's video. But he could at least have mentioned the article had claimed the relocation of the trees had already been planned and was going to take place. The main reason why this is important is that for the next 8 months, and even now at the date of writing this script, the 17th of April 2025, Jimmy would continue to tell his followers that there was no plan for the removal of the trees, even though at least as early as the last week of August 2024, he had read an article written weeks earlier which stated explicitly that the removal of the trees was already being worked on. A few examples will illustrate how Jimmy continued to tell people there was no plan to remove the trees, even though he had read an article saying there was, and that the tree removal was being coordinated with the government. On the 25th of August, a couple of days after his video, Jimmy tweeted, quote, these trees have been there for nearly 25 years now, and there is currently no plan or time frame to remove them, end quote. On the same day, he tweeted, quote, they specifically planted olive trees, knowing they cannot be cut down, end quote, without telling his audience that he had read an article dated 3 weeks earlier, which stated explicitly that the trees would be relocated, not cut down, avoiding the legal problem of olive tree felling. On the 5th of September 2024, he tweeted, quote, With the trees, there it highlights that there is no plan to excavate the ruins beneath them for the indefinite future, end quote. Again, without telling his audience, he had read an article months earlier which stated explicitly that the removal of the trees was already being worked on. Jimmy would not acknowledge the removal of the trees until it actually started taking place in February 2025, months later. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that Jimmy repeatedly told his audience to believe there was no plan to remove the trees, even though he had already read an article which said there was. There's more to say on this point, which I'll address later. Now let's return to Jimmy's claim that he was the first to raise the issue of potential damage to the site by the olive tree roots. The first time I found him saying this was in a tweet on the 5th of September 2024. Quote, "I'd like to politely remind you, I brought this important issue to everyone's attention," end quote. A few weeks later, on the 28th of September, he said, quote, "The World Economic Forum connection and issue of trees planted over Gobekli Tepe was not discussed by anyone until I brought it to light back in June," end quote. On the same day, he tweeted, quote, "I was the first and only to expose this investigation back in June," end quote. On the 11th of February 2025, he tweeted, quote, "Literally nobody had ever brought up the issue of trees prior to my expose on it," end quote. Unfortunately, that's not true. Firstly, let's remember this issue was already known and was already being addressed at the same time that Jimmy was claiming archaeologists were doing nothing about it. On the 23rd of August 2024, Dr. Lee Clare, one of the archaeologists at Gobekli Tepe, was interviewed by fellow archaeologist Flint Dibble. In this video, Lee stated explicitly that the olive trees, quote, "do in a way help hold the soil, but they're being constantly monitored to make sure they are not causing damage to the underlying features," end quote. Of course, I've already also cited an article published on the 1st of August 2024, which Jimmy himself read, stating explicitly that the excavation team was already, quote, "working with the Culture and Tourism Ministry to relocate the trees without disrupting the ongoing work or damaging the trees," end quote. So by the time Jimmy first mentioned the potential of tree root damage in June 2024, archaeologists were already aware of it and responding to it. But we can go back even further than this. An article in Turkey Today, published on the 23rd of February 2025, quoted a statement from Necmi Carroll, which he had made all the way back in July 2024, saying, quote, "The removal of these trees has been under discussion for a long time. This is not a hidden issue. Landowners themselves have acknowledged it. The excavation team has been working to ensure the proper relocation of the trees, and we expect this process to be completed soon," end quote. Remember, although that article was published in February 2025, it's quoting a statement made by Necmi Carroll all the way back in July 2024. And in that statement, Necmi is saying the relocation of the trees had been under discussion for a long time. Now, that's already enough to contradict Jimmy's repeated claim throughout 2024 that there was no plan to remove the trees. But although Necmi said the tree removal had been, quote, "under discussion for a long time," end quote, someone might quibble that the public statement quoted from him only dates to July 2024, whereas Jimmy made his statement in June. So let's go back to a chapter section in a book published in September 2023, in which geoarchaeologist Julia Schernicker commented on her own survey of Gobekli Tepe, writing, quote, "The olive trees in particular are high impact as their roots disturb the stratigraphy of the mound," end quote. The stratigraphy is the order of layers on an archaeological site. In an undisturbed site, the deepest layers are the oldest and the highest layers are the youngest, which helps archaeologists differentiate between events in the site's history over time. Even shallow roots can disrupt the stratigraphy of a site's earliest layers, since they displace the soil in ways which can move older layers or artifacts over younger ones, or combine layers until they are difficult to distinguish from each other. Although Schernicker only expresses concern over site stratigraphy, not physical damage by the roots to physical structures, certainly not to the buildings which lay 10 meters below the surface, she indisputably raised the potential of tree root damage at least 9 months before Jimmy did. Remember, we already saw Oliver Dietrich explaining to Jimmy in June 2024 that the trees had not yet been removed, quote, because they stand in areas with over 1 meter of rubble above archaeological structures, end quote, adding, quote, the roots are preventing erosion, thus in fact protecting the archaeology, end quote. In passing, I'd also like to cite a couple of other public references to the olive trees, one in an online Medium article in which the author wrote, quote, it is perhaps significant that much of the Gobekli Tepe excavation area has, circa 2020, been planted with olive trees, which legally cannot be excavated, end quote. Although this makes no mention of potential damage, it does express the concern that the trees were preventing excavation and could not be removed, which Jimmy would not mention until at least a year and a half later. More subtly, but still clearly, is the concern expressed sarcastically in a tweet dated 15th of February 2021, which says, quote, we must have the most important archaeological find in recent times. Perhaps it will serve to find the truth. Gobekli Tepe. What do? Let's plant trees on top. Really? Yes. And if they are mangrove, better. Okay. End quote. It's not as explicit as Jimmy's statement, but the concern is obvious. However, we can go back at least 4 years earlier and find much more explicit statements. Jimmy claims there was never a plan to remove the trees. Jimmy's claim to have been the first to mention the potential danger of the trees and their obstruction of excavation collides with the fact that archaeologists had already been aware of this for years and had taken steps to address it. The problem is that Jimmy refused to acknowledge this. We've already seen him read an article dated 1st of August 2024, which said explicitly that archaeologists were already working on the removal of the trees, and we've seen him fail to mention this to his audience while telling them archaeologists were doing nothing about the issue. You can call that what you will, but I wouldn't call it telling the whole truth. It is the kind of omission of significant facts which people like Dan Richards, a fellow pseudo-archaeologist and friend of Jimmy's, has characterized as an intellectually dishonest omission. This is just another reason not to trust Jimmy. But Jimmy made even more trouble for himself when he rejected correction by archaeologists. Remember, back on the 12th of June 2024, Jimmy told archaeologist Oliver Dietrich, quote, there are no plans to remove these trees and excavate what's buried beneath them, end quote. He repeated this claim on the 25th of August 2024 after reading the article which said there was such a plan, saying, quote, these trees have been there for nearly 25 years now, and there is currently no plan or time frame to remove them, end quote. Again, on the 5th of September 2024, he said there is no plan to excavate the ruins beneath them for the indefinite future, end quote. On the 11th of February 2025, Jimmy triumphantly tweeted, quote, breaking, Gobekli Tepe excavation finally moves forward. 1,000 olive trees to be removed for progress. Is this a good decision for Gobekli Tepe? End quote. In response, one of his followers commented, quote, I wonder what led them to remove the trees in the first place, end quote. Jimmy responded modestly, quote, I don't believe it, I know it, as literally nobody had ever brought up the issue of trees prior to my expose on it, end quote. Over the next few weeks, both Jimmy and his followers would credit Jimmy with the trees removal. However, the issue wasn't quite over yet. On the 18th of March 2025, while addressing historian of antiquity David Miano, Jimmy again asserted, quote, there was no plan to remove the trees, end quote. In a subsequent exchange, David cited Lee Clare's video interview with Flint Dibble on the 23rd of August 2024, saying, quote, notice that he says that they're being constantly monitored, exactly as Carl said. This establishes conclusively that the tree situation was of enough concern to be monitored before it ever went viral on social media last year, end quote. In response, Jimmy merely commented, quote, unreal to see a PhD who teaches at college be so oblivious, end quote. This was not a successful response to David's factual statement, since it simply ignored what he had written. David, acting in very good faith and being extremely fair to Jimmy, wrote, quote, "We have no documentation of whether they were or weren't planning to remove the trees. Even Lee Clare didn't say one way or the other. All we have is Necmi Carroll's testimony," end quote. However, as I will show, we do have such documentation. On the 30th of March 2025, Jimmy tweeted a clip of a video in which Milo Rossi and Flint Dibble discussed the Gobekli Tepe situation, and Flint said that the trees removal was already present in the excavation site management plan at least 2 years ago. Jimmy dogmatically asserted this was a lie, saying, quote, "So get this, Flint, along with Mini Minuteman Milo Rossi, planned to present verifiably false info regarding the Gobekli Tepe tree removal situation," end quote, adding, quote, "The 179-page site management plan says absolutely nothing about the trees whatsoever, much less any plan to remove them. Do a word search for tree after clicking on the link down below and see for yourself," end quote, further asserting, quote, "Fact, there was absolutely no plan to remove the destructive tree roots until after I put this on blast," end quote. And, quote, "Dr. Lee Clare, head of fieldwork and research at Gobekli Tepe, admitted 6 months ago that there was no plan to remove them at that time," end quote. Jimmy provided no evidence that Lee had made any such statement, and having watched his interview with Flint, I couldn't see Lee making any such statement. And I've quoted what Lee said about those trees several times already, so you can see for yourself and make your own judgment. But more important was Jimmy's assertion that the official site management plan, which he claimed to have linked to, quote, "says absolutely nothing about the trees whatsoever, much less any plan to remove them," end quote. It was useful that Jimmy had provided a link to what he claimed was the official site management plan, so I clicked on it to read it. As soon as I did so, it became clear that Jimmy had not read it himself, which was certainly indicated by his invitation to, quote, "do a word search for tree after clicking on the link down below and see for yourself," end quote, which is clearly all he had done. If Jimmy had actually read the document to which he linked, even the first page, he would have found it was not the official site management report as he claimed. Instead, it was a university student's PhD thesis, in which the student made their own suggestions for Gobekli Tepe's management. This should have been obvious to Jimmy from the cover page alone, the very first page of the document, which carried the title, quote, "A thesis submitted to the Graduate School of Engineering and Sciences of Izmir Institute of Technology in partial recognition of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Architectural Restoration." You don't need to be an archaeologist to read that and realize it is indisputably not Gobekli Tepe's official site management plan. But it seems Jimmy didn't even read the cover page, let alone the rest of it, providing a valuable insight into Jimmy's research methods. Nevertheless, Jimmy continued to assert he was right, totally oblivious to his error, tweeting, quote, "There was no site management plan in existence involving the removal of trees at Gobekli Tepe," end quote. In another tweet, Jimmy cited the same document again, writing, quote, "This is the site management plan that Flint falsely claimed addressed a plan to remove the trees. There was no plan in existence to do that." Of course, he was wrongly linking to the PhD thesis, not to any site management plan Flint had ever cited. David Miano calmly corrected Jimmy's error, tweeting, quote, "Please keep in mind that this dissertation is by a student, and these proposals are his own," end quote. At this point, Jimmy should have acknowledged his error, thanked David, and at least deleted his tweets falsely representing the PhD thesis as the official excavation site management plan. But unfortunately, he did not. Instead, he simply ignored the correction, responding with, quote, "Please keep in mind that Flint Dibble and Milo Rossi intended to cite a Gobekli Tepe site management plan in an attempt to claim that plans were already made years ago to remove the trees. None of the site management plans say this whatsoever," end quote. Remember, Jimmy had not quoted or even cited any of the real site management plans at this point, and I believe he had not read any of them at all, so his claim that none of them contained a plan to remove the trees was not based on any evidence. He just made it up. Flint Dibble, whom Jimmy had accused of lying about the site management report, responded with, quote, "Not a lie, just reporting what we were told," end quote, adding, quote, "That isn't an official site management plan, it's a PhD thesis," end quote, though he blocked Jimmy shortly after, so it's unclear if Jimmy ever saw that tweet. Nevertheless, despite several people telling Jimmy that he had falsely represented a student's PhD thesis as the official site management plan, including myself, and despite me explaining where the genuine site management plan could be found, and despite archaeologist Dan Fallu actually providing a link to the relevant site for Jimmy's convenience, Jimmy simply ignored the correction and repeatedly returned to his broader claim that no official site management plan had ever mentioned any removal of the trees. Note that during this time he failed to provide any links to any of the official site management plans in support of his claim. I don't think he ever visited the site to which I had guided him, or even clicked on the link which Dan graciously gave him. Mistaking a random PhD thesis for an archaeological site management plan is certainly an indicator of research quality, but failing to even click on a link he had been given is definitely an indicator of how much Jimmy really wanted to research this topic. On the 31st of March 2025, Jimmy challenged David Miano, tweeting, quote, "None of the official site management plans for Gobekli Tepe state anything about the trees, much less any plan to remove them," end quote. On the same day, bioarchaeologist Scott Haddo made a good faith effort to help Jimmy, tweeting, quote, "There's a genuine site management plan available on the UNESCO website for Gobekli Tepe, published in 2017. The olive trees are mentioned as part of a recent and somewhat artificial component of the tell's current environment," end quote. Please note that this is exactly the site to which I had already directed Jimmy, and exactly the plan to which Dan Fallu and I had already directed him, and for which Dan had already given the link. Since Jimmy couldn't bring himself to even click on the link, now someone was literally reading the document to him and giving him actual screenshots of the pages with the relevant text highlighted. Jimmy was certainly being spoiled at this point. The section quoted by Scott is on page 39 of the main site management plan document, which states, quote, "Also, along the slopes and in its hollows, olive plantations cover considerable parts of the mound. These were planted shortly prior to the registration of Gobekli Tepe as an archaeological conservation site and represent a recent and somewhat artificial but currently substantial part of the tell's vegetation," end quote. Scott added in another tweet, quote, "In the policy section, Policy 33 states that any later and intrusive features that have a negative impact on the character of the site should be removed. The olive trees are exactly the sort of intrusive feature that would be covered by such a policy," end quote. This was from page 97 of that site management plan document, which reads, quote, "Policy 42. Existing features in the site setting that are later and intrusive additions or have a negative character on the cultural significance of the site, including the character and the spirit of the place, should be removed," end quote. This is already enough to demonstrate the plan intended that the trees would be removed, since they had already been identified as, quote, "intrusive additions," end quote, earlier in the report. But as if that wasn't clear enough, the next sentence reads, quote, "The replanting of trees and plants in the future should have some regard for precedent and should only be done as part of an overall scheme outlined in the program of works," end quote. Consequently, Scott added in a third tweet, quote, "So it seems clear, even if it isn't spelled out precisely in the document, that the olive trees were always intended to be removed," end quote. Unfortunately, instead of being grateful for Scott's helpful correction, Jimmy simply attempted to deny what he had been told, responding, quote, that 2017 document articulates no date or plan to remove the trees, only that they could be removed if they need to be, end quote. This was not an intellectually honest response. Jimmy's previous claims had been, quote, there was no plan to remove the trees, end quote, and, quote, there was absolutely no plan to remove the destructive tree roots until after I put this on blast, end quote, and, quote, there was no site management plan in existence involving the removal of trees at Gobekli Tepe, end quote, and, quote, there was no site management plan existed for the removal of these trees until after I put this on blast in June 2024, end quote, and, quote, none of the site management plans say this whatsoever, end quote, and, quote, none of the official site management plans for Gobekli Tepe state anything about the trees, much less any plan to remove them, end quote. All of these statements were false and had categorically been proved false by this quotation from the site management plan. The very fact that Jimmy had to change his previously rigid wording to the quite different objection that the site management plan, quote, articulates no date or plan to remove the trees, and, quote, only that they could be removed if they need to be, end quote, demonstrates he realized he could no longer maintain his original claim. All he could do now was abandon it and make a new claim sounding at least similar in an attempt to mitigate the damage the facts had made to his original assertion. But even after switching to his new claim, Jimmy never explained why the plan said the trees would be, quote, removed if they need to, end quote. What need would that be? And how would the excavation staff know? Obviously, the need would be if the trees were potentially damaging the archaeological site in some way, and the excavation staff would know because they would be monitoring the trees. Remember, this statement in the site management plan totally discredited Jimmy's original claim that the trees had been planted in order to prevent excavation as part of a conspiracy, and discredited his later claim that he was the first to raise the issue of the potential tree root damage, and discredited his claim that, quote, there was no site management plan in existence involving the removal of trees at Gobekli Tepe, and discredited his claim that, quote, none of the official site management plans for Gobekli Tepe state anything about the trees, much less any plan to remove them, end quote. Jimmy further claimed, quote, it is clear that they were not monitoring the tree root damage, end quote. But of course, he provided no evidence for this. He also commented, quote, you gonna pretend they knew these roots were damaging the ruins all this time and chose to do nothing about it, end quote. But of course, there was no need to draw such a conclusion at all. On the contrary, the logical conclusion to draw was that the roots were not, quote, damaging the ruins all this time, end quote, which is why the trees had not been removed. Remember, Dr. Lee Clare had already said this all the way back in August 2024. Remember also that Oliver Dietrich had already told Jimmy exactly this on the 12th of June 2024, saying that the trees had not yet been removed, quote, because they stand in areas with over 1 meter of rubble above archaeological structures, end quote, adding, quote, the roots are preventing erosion, thus in fact protecting the archaeology, end quote. But surprisingly, Jimmy returned to his original dogmatically worded claim, tweeting on the 1st of April 2025, quote, August 23, 2024, Head of Fieldwork and Research at Gobekli Tepe, Dr. Lee Clare. According to him, there was no known root damage at that time, and they would continue to monitor the roots. There was no plan to remove them at that time, and that is made clear in the clip down below. Regardless of what any of us think happened, it is a fact. There was no plan to remove 1,000 olive trees at that time. And that's the entire point, end quote. I informed Jimmy several times that the site management plan did in fact state what he was claiming it did not state, and I further commented that if he had in fact read the real site management plan, he hadn't read it sufficiently thoroughly, since there was relevant information in it which even Scott hadn't quoted. Jimmy and his followers became increasingly frustrated with my suggestion that they read the site management plan before making claims about it, repeatedly requesting that I just show them the information instead so they wouldn't have to read the document for themselves. but I advised them I was saving it for this video. So here it is. Formal reports such as archaeological field reports often come in the form of several documents written over time. This is certainly the case for the 2018 Gobekli nomination plan, which consists of 7 documents and over 500 pages, some of which were written in 2016 and 2017. The entire 7 documents consist of an executive summary, nomination text, annexes, maps, the main management plan, the advisory body interim report, and supplementary information. All of this comprises the official site nomination plan. Scott had cited only one of these 7 documents, the main management plan, and Jimmy appeared completely unaware of all the others. Being used to such reports myself, I decided to locate and read every one of the 7 documents, which took a few days. There were pages and pages of complex technical data about environmental management concerns, funding, excavation details, construction plans, and other issues. There were many detailed diagrams and large photos, and there was a lot of technical, archaeological, and construction language I didn't understand and had to basically skim read. But in the annexes, which were written in January 2017, I found a letter dated 23rd of February 2016 recording a formal site management decision, which included the statement, quote, "The trees planted recently in the first-degree archaeological site, which damages the archaeological elements, shall be uprooted by the Excavation Directorate and planted in different areas," end quote. Later adding, quote, "The trees which damage the archaeological elements can be uprooted by the Excavation Directorate," end quote. This is an undeniable explicit statement that trees which damaged any of the archaeological elements would be removed and relocated, indicating the excavation staff were aware of the potential danger they represented and were monitoring them. Remember, this is a public document which has been on the UNESCO World Heritage website for years, but Jimmy never found it. It's worth asking him if he even looked. Possibly he just didn't know where to look, which is why he ended up Googling a student's PhD thesis instead. Not only does this 2016 statement contradict Jimmy's claims that, quote, "there was no plan to remove the trees," end quote, and, quote, "there was absolutely no plan to remove the destructive tree roots until after I put this on blast," end quote, it further disproves his claim that he was the first to raise the potential danger of the trees, as well as disproving his claims that, quote, "there was no site management plan in existence involving the removal of trees at Gobekli Tepe," end quote, and, quote, "there was no site management plan existed for the removal of these trees until after I put this on blast in June 2024, end quote, and, quote, "none of the official site management plans for Gobekli Tepe state anything about the trees, much less any plan to remove them," end quote, and, quote, "none of the site management plans say this whatsoever," end quote. But there's more. The information I've quoted was in the annexes. In the supplementary information document, dated to the end of 2017, I found a progress report which outlined plans for, quote, "preparation and implementation of a program for monitoring environmental impacts during and after construction," end quote, and, quote, "environmental oversight," end quote, to be carried out from the 4th of September 2016 to the 31st of October 2017. This makes it clear the site was being monitored for environmental impact due to the construction of facilities on the site. But there's still more. Later in the supplementary information document, I found a list of, quote, "Gobekli Tepe Conservation Plan conservation priorities," end quote, which described, quote, "site presentation, conservation, and research objectives," end quote, and an action plan with, quote, "a high priority for conservation measures," end quote. Within the list of high priority actions, I found, quote, "priority 4, long-term activities, Removal of olive trees. Impact of roots on unexcavated archaeological heritage. End quote. This is an indisputable, explicit statement dating to the end of 2017 that the excavation team were already aware of the potential danger of the olive tree roots on the unexcavated archaeological remains, and that they planned to remove them. Jimmy was not the first to identify the potential risk of the olive tree roots, nor the first to call for their removal, nor did the excavation team only decide to remove them as a result of his tweets and YouTube videos. Why you can't rely on Jimmy to tell the facts. Jimmy was at least 8 years late to drawing attention to the potential damage represented by the olive tree roots, 8 years late to the suggestion that they should be removed, and 7.5 years late to the realization that the excavation team was already aware of the tree root risk and had already planned to remove them. Here's another example of just how unaware Jimmy was of the facts. On the 11th of February 2025, Jimmy tweeted a screenshot of an electronically translated article from the Turkish news service Cumhuriyet and writing, quote, "Authorities at Gobekli Tepe admit that the roots of the trees are damaging ruins beneath them." Article dated February 11, 2025, end quote. Jimmy highlighted the section which talked about tree root damage, but he missed a far more important section due to his lack of awareness of the facts. I'm quoting here a Google translation of the same article, which has only marginally different wording. Jimmy's electronic translation screenshot says the trees, quote, "were already supposed to be abolished, and for this there is a decision taken by the Protection Board," end quote. My Google translation is a slightly more refined presentation of the same information, saying the trees, quote, "should have been removed long ago, and the Conservation Board has also made a decision for this," end quote. Instead of saying the trees should have been abolished, my Google translation says more accurately that they should have been removed. But you can see that in both cases, the article clearly refers to a decision which had already been made for the removal of the trees, and that's what Jimmy totally missed. So what was that decision, and where is the evidence for it? Well, I already showed it to you earlier in this video. It was the decision made all the way back in February 2016, and I'll quote from it again now. Quote, "Decision date, February 23rd, 2016, end quote. And then, quote, "The trees planted recently in the first-degree archaeological site which damages the archaeological elements shall be uprooted by the Excavation Directorate and planted in different areas," end quote. And, quote, "The trees which damage the archaeological elements can be uprooted by the Excavation Directorate," end quote. So in February 2025, Nekmi Karo referred specifically to the February 2016 decision, which had already been made specifically to remove the trees. Again, that's clear evidence that the tree removal had been planned over 8 years before Jimmy was tweeting about it. This is another example of why you can't rely on Jimmy to tell the facts. He just isn't good at finding them. He somehow read that article with its reference to the tree removal decision by the Conservation Board and never thought of investigating it to find out what that decision was and when it had been made. Remember that throughout the entire time Jimmy had been discussing the Gobekli Tepe tree issue on Twitter and YouTube, he had been corrected repeatedly by archaeologists and had persistently denied the facts they presented, accused them of lying, or simply ignored them. Yet they had been right all along. When it comes to archaeology, it's much more sensible to trust real archaeologists who know what they're talking about because they do the study, do the research, and do the real field work on site, rather than relying on fake archaeologists who think they can do archaeology from their armchair. Jimmy and Dan's attempt at damage control. Remember, Jimmy spent about 8 months persistently denying there were ever any plans to remove these trees. He continued to do so even after he had read an article saying such plans had been made, and even after I and others told him very plainly that such plans had existed for years, and even after we had told him where to find those plans, and even after he had been given screenshots from them. However, in the last couple of weeks, especially after I made it clear that I was going to release this video providing the evidence for those plans, Jimmy's story has changed, as he has now realised he was wrong all along. Jimmy and his fellow pseudo-archaeologist Dan Richards are now making new arguments and avoiding even mentioning their previous claims that these plans never existed. So let's look at what they said originally and how their story has changed. You'll notice that they don't want to talk about their previous claims, or even acknowledge those claims were wrong, or apologise for them. We've already seen that plans were made to remove the trees as early as February 2016. We saw how, about 8.5 years later, Jimmy started claiming that the trees had been planted to prevent excavation. We've seen how Jimmy was repeatedly corrected by archaeologists telling him the trees had been planted by the original landowners for money before these areas were purchased by the government, and we've seen him deny this, saying it made no sense. We've also seen that months after denying this, he finally accepted it was true, though he failed to acknowledge he had been wrong for months and the archaeologists had been right, and he didn't apologise to his followers for misleading them all that time. We've seen Jimmy quote parts of an article to his audience in August 2024, while not telling them about the part of the article which stated explicitly that archaeologists were already working with the government to remove the trees. As we've seen, when attention was brought to the fact that the site management plan had recorded the decision to remove the trees years ago, Jimmy and Dan first tried to deny this and argued no such plans existed. But recently they've realised the plans do exist, and they know I'm making this video, so they're abandoning their original arguments and inventing new ones. Let's see what they are saying now. On the 22nd of April 2025, Jimmy posted, quote, "Question. If archaeologists were monitoring the tree roots, then why did they allow them to damage the ancient ruins before removing them?" End quote. Well, Jimmy, you don't seem to realise that they would only know of any root damage if they were monitoring the roots. You also don't seem to realise that there isn't actually any hard evidence yet that the roots have damaged any ancient ruins. English media and Turkish media news services have somewhat different wording on this issue, especially when it comes to quoting Necmi Karol, but it's clear that Necmi's statements in Turkish in a range of articles say the trees are being removed out of concern that, quote, "their roots have reached a point where they will damage the remains below the surface," end quote. Not that they already have damaged them. How would archaeologists even know this? Because they have been monitoring the tree roots. On the 23rd of April 2025, Dan made a different argument, tweeting, quote, "When their documentation for the site management plan says we will remove the trees if there's an issue, and they do not remove the trees until Jimmy starts screaming from the rooftops, the issue was social pressure. They didn't remove them before, they did after he drew attention to the issue," end quote. Firstly, note that it took Dan this long to finally acknowledge what I and real archaeologists had been telling him all along, that the 2017 site management plan did contain a plan to remove the trees. Secondly, note that Dan still isn't citing the plan correctly, since the plan not only said the trees could be removed if their roots were damaging the site, but also stated twice that the trees would be removed in the medium and long term. Not simply if they caused damage, but that they would be removed in any case to prevent damage by the roots. Thirdly, note that Dan provides no evidence for the claim that the trees were removed as a result of social pressure by Jimmy. We've already seen that archaeologists were working with the government to remove the trees all the way back in 2024, even before Jimmy raised the issue. And remember, Jimmy even read an article which said this, though he didn't tell his audience that this was happening. But let's look at some reasons why it took time to remove the trees. Remember, some of them were planted in 2005 and 2006, and the youngest of them were planted in around 2020, according to Necmi Karol. You can even see in the image I've placed on screen here how small some of these trees were in 2017. But the state's expropriation of the site didn't take place until 2007, 2 years after the first of these trees were planted, and it didn't receive World Heritage status until 2013, another 6 years later again. This is all in the 2017 Site Management Plan, which neither Jimmy or Dan have read. You can tell just how uninterested they really are in the management of Gobekli Tepe by the fact that they haven't bothered to read and report on any of the site management documentation. But there's more. The 2017 Site Management Plan shows that even in that year, parts of the site were still under private ownership, or split between state and private ownership, noting, quote, "Some parts of the third-degree archaeological conservation site are under private ownership," end quote. The International Council on Monuments and Sites report on Gobekli Tepe, dated the 14th of March 2018, observed that even in that year, quote, "ownership of the nominated property and its buffer zone is split between the state and individual private landowners," end quote, adding, quote, "The parcels of the nominated property all belong to the state party. About 12 landowners have parcels used for grazing and farming," end quote. At this point, the state owned most of the land in which olive trees were situated, but Nechmi Karel has said some of the olive trees are only around 5 years old, so they must have been planted after 2018. Remember also, Oliver Dietrich told Jimmy all the way back in June 2024 that the trees had not yet been removed because they weren't posing a danger at that time, saying, quote, "They stand in areas with over 1 meter of rubble above archaeological structures," end quote, adding, quote, "The roots are preventing erosion, thus, in fact, protecting the archaeology," end quote. This was clear evidence that the trees were being monitored, since Oliver knew how far they were above any archaeological remains beneath. Now, it's true that Jimmy and Dan didn't believe this, but they can't deny they were given a reason why the trees hadn't been removed all the way back in June 2024, and they really should mention that. Remember also, the law prohibited the trees being simply cut down. They had to be transplanted, and to do that successfully, as Nechmi Karel explained in an article on the 13th of February 2025, quote, "We waited for the right season for this. Now is an ideal time to move the trees," end quote. What does he mean by the right time and season? It's partly related to the tree's size and age. Nejmi further explained, quote, "There are around 800 trees. Their ages are different, but the oldest is about 15 years old, so they are neither too big nor too small," end quote. There are also ideal seasons in which to transplant olive trees, regardless of age, but I'll focus on their age. More specifically still, the article tells us, quote, "Karel said that they waited for the right time for the trees to survive during the transportation process," end quote. Quoting Nechmi saying, quote, "We will not allow even a single tree to be cut down here," end quote, and adding, quote, "That is why the right time was waited for. They will be transported with the right method," end quote. All of this information is freely available online. Jimmy and Dan could have found it, but they didn't. Did they even look? They don't have to agree with it, but they shouldn't act like it doesn't exist. So what is a good age at which to transplant olive trees? An olive tree propagation manual published in 2004 by the Australian government's science organisation, the CSIRO, advises, quote, "Transplanting is done after 3 to 5 years," end quote, adding, quote, "It is not advisable to transplant olives that are less than a year old because of the considerable amount of care they need," end quote. Even under very controlled conditions, olive tree transplantation is hazardous for the trees. A 2020 paper in the journal Agricultural and Forest Meteorology described an experiment testing the factors influencing successful transplantation of mature olive trees at estimated ages of 15 to 25 years, which were prepared carefully for transplantation by pruning and other protective measures. And despite this care, some of the trees still died 3 years later. But let's be clear, None of that is going to change the minds and messages of people who earn money by saying Gobekli Tepe's excavation is being mismanaged, or people who simply prefer to believe that. So let's remind ourselves that the burden of evidence rests on those who make those claims. Jimmy and Dan need to provide evidence for their claims that the trees should have been moved earlier, and they need to specify the kind and extent of damage, if any, the existing tree roots have already caused. The problem with this is that the only information Jimmy and Dan have about the olive trees and the site itself is provided by real archaeologists. Pseudo-archaeology is, by its nature, inherently parasitic. Pseudo-archaeologists typically work in their armchair, selecting information from the work of real archaeologists and making their own claims about it. They usually don't do any archaeological work. Even Jimmy, who has visited Gobekli Tepe in person, didn't do anything remotely close to amateur archaeology. Instead, he engaged in the established pseudo-archaeology practice of pointiness, which involves gesturing at things and making unsubstantiated claims about them. Jimmy points at an object and tells you how old it is. Jimmy points at a hole and tells you it was drilled through priceless archaeological remains. Jimmy points at trees and tells you they're destroying structures beneath the soil. How does he know all this? Because he pointed at things. What more do you want? Pseudo-archaeologists like Jimmy and Dan gain their followers online because it's a venue in which they can air their claims with minimal effort and minimal resistance. They won't ever write or submit any of their claims to professionals through formal processes like peer review. They'll have all kinds of excuses as to why they won't do that, but the main reason is they know their claims can't withstand the scrutiny of people with relevant knowledge and skills. Instead, they target people who already want to believe them, who won't fact-check them, and who are the least likely to have any understanding of the topics on which they communicate. Real archaeologists do the work. They spend years learning relevant knowledge and skills. They actually examine artifacts. They may do physical fieldwork, and they submit their findings to the strenuous process of peer review in order to test their hypotheses and claims. They aren't afraid of scrutiny by professionals, and they are prepared to change their views when they are corrected with evidence through the scientific method. Real archaeologists can't hold a good job unless they maintain high standards of research quality, intellectual rigor, and intellectual honesty. They join professional organizations with standards of ethical practice. Pseudo-archaeologists can earn a lot of money even if they don't maintain any such standards at all. In my view, the worst aspect of pseudo-archaeologists is their sheer lack of interest in the real past, the real history which real archaeologists uncover. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of research has been published freely online by real archaeologists working at Gobekli Tepe, but Jimmy and Dan have read almost none of it. Countless articles, blog posts, and images on Gobekli Tepe have been generated by real archaeologists, but Jimmy and Dan ignore virtually all of it. It's not even that they're uninterested in the conclusions of those archaeologists. They don't even study the raw data which has been uncovered. Real archaeologists are out there providing a public service by providing free information on just about every aspect of Gobekli Tepe you can think of and what it tells us about the past because they're genuinely intrigued by all of it. But Jimmy and Dan don't tell you about any of that. You can see their videos have only two main uses for Gobekli Tepe. The first is to use as a prop for their claims of an ancient advanced civilization wiped out by a natural disaster. And the second is to try and convince people of conspiracy theories which denigrate real archaeologists, deride the field of archaeology itself, and persuade their audience that they should be followed and listened to instead of professionals. It's true, they are motivated by their belief in this ancient advanced civilization, which they want people to know about, But it's also true they make money from this, and the more people they convince to trust them over real archaeologists, the more money they can make. Oh, you want to know what I get for making my videos? Well, I don't monetize any of my videos, and I turn down sponsorship offers, so I get to spend 10 hours of my own time researching, writing, and producing a 30 to 50 minute video instead of using that time earning money for my freelance work. I write journal papers for free, give conference presentations for free, and do academic editing work for free. Now, to place these pseudo-archaeologists in their context, it's worth remembering that their following is virtually entirely online. In the broader context of science, archaeology, education, and society itself, they have no more impact than flat earthers. They don't produce any new archaeological findings, their arguments don't find their way into scholarly journals or education curricula, and their YouTube channels will fade when they are gone. Their audience is as fringe as their ideas. 50 years from now, no one is going to be reading a textbook explaining why Jimmy Corsetti thinks Flint Dibble is a liar, or describing Dan Richards' theory about Atlantis. Sure, no one is going to be reading about Flint Dibble either, and his YouTube channel will be gone too, just like mine. But people will be reading his publications, and they will be studying fields while being informed by his discoveries and archaeological commentary. He will have made a genuine contribution to the understanding of human history. Pseudo-archaeologists have been recycling the same material and arguments for at least 4 centuries. And even the new material they present is typically based on the work of real archaeologists, on whom they ironically depend for their livelihood. The true record of humanity is being told by real archaeologists because they are motivated by a desire to preserve and teach our shared history. Questions for Jimmy and Dan. In this section, I'm openly asking Jimmy Corsetti and Dan Richards a number of questions which I believe they should answer in order to demonstrate their integrity. Jimmy and Dan, you both pride yourself on intellectual honesty, and Dan, you in particular have shown intellectual honesty in acknowledging errors you've made in the past and apologizing to your followers in good faith for misleading them. I've noted that in my videos on you, observing that's admirable behavior, and I'm appealing to your integrity now to answer these questions. Jimmy, why did you continue to claim in 2024 that trees had been planted to prevent the Gobekli Tepe excavation when it had already been known for years that the trees were planted by private landowners before the site was owned by the government to increase the government's expropriation payment? Even Dan said you were wrong about this in a video back on the 2nd of September 2024, in which he stated, quote, "I do have to disagree with what Jimmy said in the previous video, where he said that there was no way that, planting trees would raise the property value," end quote, adding, quote, "I understand why they would have started slapping trees up on it really quick," end quote. Dan is to be credited with intellectual honesty for agreeing with what archaeologists such as Lee Clare and Flint Dibble had been saying, that the original landowners had planted the trees for money. Dan, on the 2nd of September 2024, you claimed that, quote, "The immediate reason that you'll hear from most archaeologists and debunkers is that these trees were planted to stop topsoil erosion to preserve the site," end quote. Where is your evidence for this? Please show that most archaeologists and debunkers were saying the reason why the trees at Gobekli Tepe had been planted was to stop topsoil erosion to preserve the site. On the contrary, most of them were pointing out that the trees had been planted by the original landowners for money, a fact you didn't start publicizing until months later, and which Jimmy was still denying. Dan, on the 23rd of August 2024, you had made an even stronger claim, asserting specifically that, quote, "Flint Dibble, Lee Clare himself, the archaeologist in charge of the site, Dan Fallu," end quote, as well as other archaeologists you didn't name, quote, "defended the trees, saying they were there to stop erosion," end quote. Again, you provided no evidence that any of these archaeologists said the trees were planted to stop erosion. Show us direct quotations from every one of these people saying the trees had been planted to stop erosion. Remember, both Flint and Lee noted the trees at Gobekli Tepe could potentially damage the site, even though they both said the trees could have the positive side effect of preventing erosion. Dan, why did you not tell your audience that archaeologists had been saying for months that the trees were planted by landowners for money, while Jimmy was claiming they had been planted to prevent the site's excavation? Jimmy and Dan, why did you continue to claim in 2004, and even all the way to the end of March 2025, that there was never any plan to remove the olive trees at Gobekli Tepe until after Jimmy started agitating for it, when in fact such plans had existed since 2016 and were publicly available online? Why did you not tell your followers about these plans? Jimmy, you even read an article in August 2024 which said the archaeologists were already working on removing the trees in discussion with the government. Why did you not tell your followers this and instead tell your audience archaeologists were doing nothing about the trees? Dan, you challenged historian David Miano on this point on the 19th of March 2025, saying, quote, "Find me the article from 5 years ago discussing plans to remove the trees. Show me the discourse," end quote, saying it seemed to you that David was just making things up. I warned you at that time, in full good faith, not to follow Jimmy's false claims about plans to remove the trees. Now I've shown you conclusively that these plans have existed for years. Will you acknowledge publicly you were wrong about this and apologize to David? Jimmy, on the 30th of March 2025, you accused Flint and Milo of lying about the site management plan containing a plan to remove the trees, and you further claimed, quote, "The 179-page site management plan says absolutely nothing about the trees whatsoever, much less any plan to remove them," end quote. But you linked to a random university student's PhD thesis instead of the actual official site management plan. You even claimed that the document to which you linked was the plan cited by Flint. Now I've shown you conclusively that these plans have existed for years. Will you acknowledge publicly you were wrong about this and apologize to Flint and Milo? How about acknowledging you linked to a completely irrelevant document, which you didn't even read, and totally misrepresented it? It would be appropriate to apologize to your audience for that as well, though it's ironic that none of them realized your error. Jimmy and Dan, you have misled your followers for months on these issues while abusing archaeologists who were telling the truth. Will you acknowledge publicly you were wrong about all these issues and at least apologize to your followers for misleading them for months? Questions you might still have. This video is already far too long for the average YouTube viewer, but for those of you who are still watching, I'd like to anticipate a few questions you might still have. 1. Given the olive tree removal was approved and planned as far back as 2016, why has it taken so long to actually remove them? 2. How were archaeologists checking that the tree roots weren't causing damage during this time? 3. Have any of Gobekli Tepe's archaeological remains been damaged by tree roots, and how do we know? I will address these questions in an upcoming video, which will incorporate valuable information provided to me very generously by excavation director Dr. Lee Clare, who I interviewed on the 25th of April this year.